Before this video starts, I just want to give a quick shout out to my Discord server. If you guys want to join it, the link's in the description. You can talk to me, talk around with other people, post art, ask for help, and stuff like that. So, let's get into the video. I'm here, you're here for a reason, and this video is that reason. This video is explaining from start to finish everything you need to know to get started with Blender and everything you need to know to make art, animations, and everything else in Blender. So let's get right into it, starting with the basics, how to use Blender in itself. So, when you open Blender, you're going to have a splash screen first of all. You can click off that and you'll be at this screen right here. So, at this screen, you're probably, if you're brand new to Blender, you're probably pretty intimidated because we have a cube, a camera, and a light. In your default startup file, these will be the three things that are there. They'll always be there unless you change your startup file. So how to navigate around this scene. So first of all, and pretty much the basic thing you want to do, is to pan around. So the way you do that is you click and hold your middle mouse button, and then you move around. You just drag your mouse. If you are on a laptop and you do not have access to a mouse or a middle mouse button, you can go up here to these little X, Y, and Z little bars, and then you can click in the middle of them somewhere, and then you can move around. Also, with these X, Y, and Z bars, you can snap to an axis. So if you click the Z, it snaps to the Z axis, Y to the Y axis, and X to the X axis. You can also use different shortcuts, which it says if you hover over it. So the Z axis is numpad 7, so if you hit 7 on your numpad, you go to the Z axis. Y is numpad 1, so no surprise there, you go to the Y axis. X is numpad 3. Who would have thought you went to the X axis? So that's pretty much it for the basic panning and snapping to axes. Now, how do you pan around itself? So the way to do that is, once again, you will click and hold down your middle mouse wheel, and then you'll also hit shift this time. So holding down shift and middle mouse wheel will, or shift and then middle mouse wheel will pan around. If you hit middle mouse wheel and then shift, it doesn't do anything. You have to hit shift first and then middle mouse wheel because it's sensitive like that. Okay, second is control and middle mouse. So if you hit control and then middle mouse, you'll be able to zoom in and out. You can also use your scroll wheel to zoom in and out, which is what I do a lot of time. But if you're trying to get a more accurate and closer zoom in, you can use control middle mouse. And now for context menus. So before Blender 2.8, it was right click to select. Now Blender has, from 2.8 onwards, Blender has changed to a more standard control scheme. So right clicking this time will bring up a context menu. Now in this context menu you have a ton of options, which I'll get to later, but that's how you bring up your basic context menu. And to select, you just click. And so once we have that selected, what we can do is go ahead and explain the basic layout of Blender itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is explain over here on the right all these tabs. And the first tab, and probably the most important in a lot of aspects, is the render tab. This is where you'll set up all samples, any effects for your render, and your render engine. So what your render engine is how your scene is rendered. How light, shadows, colors, everything like that is rendered out. Blender now has two render engines. Well, I guess it did have two before, but now has a different one. And that one is called Eevee. So you have two render engines. You have Cycles and Eevee. Workbench isn't necessarily a render engine. It's just kind of like a preview thing. And yeah. But your main render engines are Cycles and Eevee. So Cycles is a ray tracing engine. And basically what that means, if you don't know what ray tracing means, imagine your digital camera. Like this thing right here. So you have this camera, right? And in a ray tracing render engine, or something that is being ray traced, there are a ton of invisible rays shooting out of this camera, bouncing off of objects, and just bouncing off of different things. Now these rays are calculating lighting, shadows, global illumination, stuff like that. It's basically calculating light in a realistic way. While the real-time render engine, Eevee, it does not do that. It's not ray traced. It basically simulates everything that a ray tracing engine does, but with a bunch of math. It's typically what you would see in game engines or like preview modes in render engine or 3D softwares. Eevee's real time. The downsides of Eevee, since it's not shooting out rays and calculating lights and shadows and stuff actively, it uses math, which means it has to simulate a lot of stuff, which means that anything that has any kind of light that has to be calculated is going to be less quality. It's going to look worse than Cycles. So what I mean by that is your shadows are going to be less realistic, transparent objects and refraction is going to be less realistic, and lighting in general is going to be less realistic. That's not saying that Eevee itself is less realistic, because people can make some really cool stuff in Eevee, but Cycles is just more realistic because it's actively calculating all those lights and shadows and so on. So to show the difference between Eevee and Cycles real quick, I'm going to go ahead, and don't worry if you're going to miss this part, I'll explain it again later. I'll explain it here in a little bit, but I'm just going to add a sphere and a plane, okay? And we are going to go into Cycles first. And then we're going to go rendered mode. Don't worry about all these shortcuts I'm doing right now. I'll explain them in a second. But yeah. So if we go into Cycles, we can see that the shadows are pretty realistic. There's global illumination, so the plane is reflecting back onto the ball right here. You can see there's light on the edge of the ball. And everything just looks pretty realistic. Also, what you can see is when I move around, you have this pixelated effect. This is because Cycles uses samples. The more samples you have, the clearer your image is going to be. So it has to calculate everything, and that's what ray tracing pretty much is. It's actively shooting out these rays and calculating light and stuff. So Cycles ray tracing render engines are going to have this effect no matter which one you're going to use. Now if we switch over to Eevee, what we can see is immediately it's real time. We don't have any of that pixelated effect. We don't have anything like that. But what we can notice is the shadows are a lot less realistic. You have none of that global illumination on the edge of your ball right here, and it still looks good. It just doesn't look as realistic. You can turn on these settings right here, like you can turn on ambient occlusion. That kind of gives that shadow between objects. You can turn on bloom if you want. You can't really see it in the scene because there's nothing that affects bloom. You can change subsurface scattering. You can turn on screen space reflections. Screen space reflections kind of gives that global illumination look, but that's not actually global illumination. There's an add-on for global illumination. I did a video over it a few weeks ago, but yeah. And you have all these settings down here that you can change for Eevee, like volumetrics, normal performance, hair settings, shadows, indirect lighting, your film settings, simplify, freestyle, and color management. This right here you can change to whatever view transform you want. I recommend keeping it on Filmic because that gives a high dynamic range and makes renders look better. You can also change your contrast settings. So if I turn on very high contrast, you can see the darks get darker and the lights get lighter and different stuff like that. So now on with that, I'm going to go ahead and delete these two objects, and we're going to go into the second tab. So the second tab is your render properties. This is where you're going to set your resolution, your aspect ratio, if you're making an animation, what frame it starts and stops on, your frame rate, your stereoscopy outputs, your actual animation outputs. So you would like click this little folder, browse to wherever you want to save your animation to, and yeah, you can change your file format, like AVI, JPEG, just a bunch of image sequences, FFmpeg, which is MP4, your color scheme, black and white, RGB, and then RGBA, your color depth, 8-bit or 16-bit, and then your compression. So then you have metadata, which basically is just like little like stuff in your file data that includes the date, time, and everything that your scene was rendered in. And then post-processing, this is basically where you can enable or disable compositing in your sequencer. And yeah, so next is your layer properties. This is where you will render out any different render layers. So render layers are pretty complicated, but basically let's say you have one layer that's your main render, and then you have fog that you're rendering out, but you don't want the fog to be in the actual render. You want them to be combined into a different pass. That's what you would do here. So like, for example, you have a mist pass, your normals, You have different light passes and effects like bloom and stuff like that. Next, we have our scene properties. So this basically just is your project properties. Basically, you can set whatever camera you want. You can set whatever background scene you want, what active clip you have. You can change your units. This is basically what Blender measures different units of time in, or like weight and stuff like that. Normally it's set on metric, but you can also change it to imperial. That gives it like degrees, feet, pounds, seconds. Metric is obviously degrees, meters, kilograms, and seconds. Unit scale 1. That just basically means that the base is 1. So 1 is the base value, and then you have like you scale it up times 2, and then it's going to be 2, and different stuff like that. If you put it on none, it's just going to be 1 unit. And so that's that. You can also change your gravity settings. Gravity on Earth is 9.8 meters per second squared, so it's set by that. You don't have X and Y gravity because when you stand up, you're not moving toward left or right. You're not being forced to be moved left to right, actually, and different stuff like that. Keying sets, I'm not really sure what this does, to be honest with you. Oh god, I'm so bad at giving tutorials. Anyway, audio, you can change what kind of audio, your audio settings. I don't really know audio settings, so if you do know audio settings, then you can mess with this. I don't. You can change. You can add a rigid body world, which affects rigid bodies. You won't have this visualizer tab because that's an add-on, and then custom properties. You can add Python scripts and stuff like that. And next, you have your world properties. So this is where you would add an HDRI, change your background color, change the strength. You can change which object in your scene is a volume object. You can change the viewport display in your render, and then you have custom properties again where you can add Python stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and add another mesh, so we have these options down here. And so this option is your object properties. Object properties, you have your location, X, Y, and Z axis. You have your rotation on the X, Y, and Z axis. And then mode, you have whatever mode you want your object to be based on. You have your scale, again, on the X, Y, Z axis. And then you have your delta transforms, which I'm not really sure what that is. But yeah, relations, this is if your object has a relationship with another object, as in like being a parent, if it's being tracked to another object. And then your pass index. These pass index relate to the render layers and passes I explained earlier. So if you want this object to be on another render layer, you would just change this pass to 1 or 2 or so on. Collections are basically groups. In 2.79 they used to be groups, now they're collections, and you can add this to a different collection. Or you could also, let's say you have 2 objects, you could hit Control G, and then down here says create new collection, and now they're in a collection. So once we have that, we have your motion pass. You can calculate your motion pass. This is animation stuff right here. You can choose when it starts, end, and the step of it. Then you can calculate it and then display whatever it needs to display. Visibility, you can see show in viewports, show in renders. Basically, if you have an object that you want to be there that's only in your viewport, you can uncheck renders, and this object won't show up in your render. Or if you want it in your render but it's hogging up your viewport or something, you can change it in viewports. Or if you want the object not to be selectable, you can uncheck that little selectable option. Viewport display, you can the shadow, texture space, all edges, wireframe, axis, name, different stuff like that. And then in front, color, you can change the color of it, and display as textured, wire, solid, and then bounds. It just basically shows the wireframe of it. And then bounds, you can choose what kind of bounds your object has. So if you want the cube to have like a capsule boundary or something, you can change it to that. And then again, we have custom properties where you can add Python scripts and stuff. And next, we have modifiers. So modifiers I'll get into in a little bit, but right now, basically this is any modifier. Modifiers are just things that modify your objects in any way, shape, or form. They're really useful for modeling and just doing a lot of other stuff. Next, we have our particle properties. You would just click plus on this, and then you can change your particle settings from emitter to hair. Emitter is like more like actual particles, and then hair is just hair. This we have physics, so you can enable physics if you want it to be a force field, collision object, cloth, a dynamic pane object, a soft body, a fluid object, a rigid body, or a rigid body constraint. I know that makes no sense to you if you're watching this part right now, but it will in a little bit. And then we have object constraints. We can constrain it to certain transforms, and then we can track it to certain objects, and then we can make it a relationship, like an action relationship, an armature, a child of another object, a pivot of another object, or a shrink wrap of another object. Then we have vertex groups, which is basically going to be all the complicated stuff that you probably don't understand right now. Vertex group, this is basically any kind of group that has a select number of vertices in it. UV maps, this is where your UVs for your object are stored. I'll get into UV unwrapping here in a little bit. Vertex colors, you can change colors of specific vertices. Face maps, I don't really know what that is. If you're better at Blender than me, you probably know what that is. Normals, this is the normals of the object, which way each face is rotated and facing and stuff. Texture space, we can choose like what kind of mesh we want the texture to be put on. Remesh, this basically takes your topology of your object and then converts it to quads or voxel quads. And this is pretty cool if you really suck at modeling like me and your topology is really garbage. You can use remesh to make that better. Geometry data, this is basically like sculpt masks, skins, split normals, different stuff like that. You can also change your level of detail of the object, which is like how many, well, the detail of the object, how many polygons it has and such. Then once again, custom properties where you can add a Python script. Next is materials. So materials, I'll get into this right after this, but materials are basically what your object uses to react to light, how it reacts to things around it, what kind of textures it uses, what color it is, how rough the object is, how metallic it is, what kind of subsurface scattering it has, ambient occlusion. Basically anything that makes the object react to the world is in this materials tab. And then your textures tab, this is like for displacement maps, texture painting, different stuff like that. So, now that we have all that explained, let's move on to the shortcuts, the basic shortcuts of Blender. So, to add an object in, to add anything into your scene, you're going to hit Shift A, and it'll bring up this add menu, or you could go up here to the top left where it says View Select, Add an Object. You can click Add and it brings up the same menu, but Shift A is a lot faster. I recommend, if you haven't already, to learn all the shortcuts, or the most important shortcuts for Blender, which I'll explain here pretty much when I get to them. But Shift A, you have this context menu. If you want to add a basic primitive or a basic mesh, it's the mesh tab. You have planes, cubes, circles, UV spheres, icospheres, cylinder, cone, torus, a grid, a monkey, and a landscape. Landscape is an add-on that's built into Blender, so that won't be there for you if you don't have that add-on enabled. Next is curve, a Bezier curve, a circle curve, a NURBS circle, and a path. Those are your curve objects. You can basically, if you hit tab to go into edit mode, you can change these pivot points and stuff. It's kind of like the pen tool from Photoshop if I had to compare it to something. And then surfaces, you have different like curved surfaces and different stuff, so you can change these points and stuff and just bring these out. It's really cool. It's basically an object that is based on curves, so that's pretty cool. Then you have meta balls, which they're really cool. They do this. I'm not quite sure what meta balls are. I just know they do this, and they're really cool. They like attract each other pretty much. So that's pretty cool. I'm pretty sure you can add like other stuff too. Yeah, like a plane, and like a cube, and they just pretty much just attract each other. It's really cool, and they kind of form into one object. You have text. If you want to add a text object, to edit the text object, you hit tab, and then you can just backspace and type in whatever you want. And your delete key, I should also explain that. To delete a mesh, you can either hit delete on your keyboard or hit X and then delete. That's how you delete an object. And then you have volume objects, which is new for 2.9, which is pretty cool. Grease pencil, you have blank, strokes, and monkeys. So this is basically Blender's 2D kind of animation type stuff. You can add a blank, which is nothing, and then a stroke, which is kind of this. But yeah, armature, you can add a bone, and then that's how you rig objects and stuff. Lattice, this basically, it deforms objects based on those vertices. I'm pretty sure that's what it does at least. Empty, this is just an empty you can assign an object to. For example, if you want an object to rotate around a point, you can use this empty object, assign it to it, and have it pivot around and stuff like that. Image, you can add a reference image, a background, or an image as a plane. This is really useful if you're modeling from reference. Lights, these are your basic lights. You have a point light, a sunlight, a spotlight, and an area lights. These are all good for their own separate purposes, and I'll explain those here in a little bit. Light probe, this pretty much calculates reflections on light maps. In cycles, you don't really need these, but in Eevee, they're pretty handy. Camera, you can add another camera to your scene if you need to. Speaker, you can add a speaker which produces audio in your scene. Force field, these are force fields. If you have a simulation object or a physics object, you can use these to change those. Collection instances, you can add collections. So you can add full collections to your scene that you make, like the Control G shortcut I said earlier. And yeah, that's that. So that's your basic menu for like adding meshes and stuff. So now I'm going to Shift A and then add a cube, and we're going to use the transform shortcuts. So if you hit R on your keyboard, you can rotate your mesh around one axis. But if you double tap R, you have a trackball movement. So you can move your mesh around any axis you want. Also, if you hit R and then click while you're pulling it toward a certain direction or a certain axis, it locks it to that axis. What you could also do is hit R or whatever key you're doing, and then hit whatever axis you want, which is Z, X, or Y on your keyboard. RX is that same axis I locked it to just a second ago, and then RY is this axis, RZ is the Z axis, and stuff like that. So now that we have that, we have scaling. So scaling is bringing your object bigger or smaller, and that is S on your keyboard. So S just brings it bigger or smaller. You can also do the same ZXY or XYZ things. So S and then Z scales it on the Z axis, S and Y scales it on the Y axis, and then S and X scales it on the X axis. So now that we have that, what we can do is move the object around. So you can use either of all four of these like tools right here, which you can do perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with using these tools and stuff. It's just hotkeys are faster and just different stuff. This transform basically has all the transform stuff in it. But to actually grab an object and move it around is G on your keyboard. So if you hit G, you can move the object around and then click again to keep it like that. Now, to change your select mode, which is like circle select and stuff, you can either go up here and then hold click on it, and you can hit tweak, select box, select circle, and select lasso. Box select, you can just do this, box selects. Circle selects a circle, and then select lasso, you can just do this, and it selects like that. Also, what you can do is you can hit W on your keyboard to cycle through them, and do stuff like that. Alright, the video just had a jump cut because I had to get a drink because my throat was hurting because I was talking so much, but now we're back. And now I'm going to get into edit mode. Edit mode is what you're going to pretty much use for modeling. So to go into edit mode, what you can either do is go up here to the top left where it says object mode, click it, and then go into edit mode, or the hotkey for it in keyboard shortcut is tab. So if you hit tab on your keyboard, you go into edit mode, and yeah. What I should probably explain too is the hotkey for selecting and deselecting everything. So double tapping A deselects everything, and then tapping A selects everything. If you tap A once, it won't deselect, you have to tap it twice. Same goes for pretty much every menu in Blender. Tapping A selects it, double tapping A deselects it. The same mouse buttons apply here. Click to select a vertice. To select multiple vertices at once, you shift click, and to find the nearest path to another vertice, you control click. and it will select vertices from the path. So for example, if I wanted to get here, it'll select the closest path, and if I wanted to get down here, it would select the closest path, which is all these vertices. It's this one, this one, this one, and then finally this one. So it's really handy if you're trying to select vertices themselves. And yeah, so we have 3 select modes in edit mode. We have vertex select, edge select, and face select. The keyboard shortcuts to cycle through those is 1 is vertices select, 2 is edge select. You can see the vertices are removed and now we just have the edges. And then 3 is face select. So you can see we can't select those edges anymore. We can select individual faces though. And to extrude these faces, what we can do is we can hit E and it will extrude them. And what we can do also is if we want to inset a face or like make a face go in, we can hit I on our keyboard. Now you can also use all of these tools right here, which are you can use because you probably won't remember all these shortcuts. But once you learn the shortcuts, I very much recommend doing this. But to inset a face, you can just click I and then just drag and do that, and then you can combine that with extrude to extrude it up, and then inset it and extrude it up some more, and we have that basic model right there. You can also use the inset face right here, and then just use this little tool right here to inset them. And to extrude, extrude right here is that, and then we can do that right there. And it's basically the same thing we just did with the keyboard shortcuts. And yeah. So also in edit mode, what we can do is we can add loop cuts. Loop cuts is adding a cut in the middle of the mesh to divide faces or vertices. So the way to do that is select the entire mesh, hit Control R, and then we have this line right here, and then we can click and then drag and then put this anywhere. Once you click the second time though, the loop cut is placed and you cannot move it. So what you'll notice now is we can select these edges right here, or we can select the vertices that are made from it, or we can select the faces that were made from it. And now if we extrude, you can see that these are now separate faces, and we can extrude them like this. So that's pretty cool. That's how you add loop cuts and stuff like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and undo that. And also what we can do is we can dissolve faces if we want to. So for example, let's say I inset this face, right? But I decide I don't want that face insetted. So what we can do is select all these faces right here, all the faces on this single face, right click, and then click dissolve faces near the very bottom, and you can see it turns that back into one face. So in this context menu, what we can do is a few things. First is subdivide. This basically subdivides the face. If you have the whole model selected, it will subdivide the whole model. Once you click subdivide, you have this content menu. You can change the number of cuts up or down. And yeah, so now we have each individual face. What we can do is if we want to circle select and select all these faces, and then we want to make them back into one face, we can click dissolve, and that brings them back into one face. Next is extrude faces. It's basically just extruding them up, and yeah, it's basically the E shortcut we did earlier. Extrude faces along normals. That's basically if your object has weird normals, which is how the faces are rotated and stuff. You can extrude along your normals. Extrude individual faces. What that's useful for is, let's say you have like subdivisions on this object. Should be able to subdivide it at least. Why is my subdivision not working? Anyway, once we have our subdivisions back, I don't know why that didn't work there. If we select like these faces, right? These faces right here, or like let's say this face, and this face, and we extrude them. They basically extrude together. So if we scale them down or something, they extrude together. They stick together. And what extrude individual faces does is it basically does the exact same thing, but extrudes the individual faces along their normals. So now what we can do is some more extruding options. Is if we hit Control Shift E or Control E or Shift E. Is it Control E or is it Control Shift E? It's Alt E. Alt E. We can extrude individual faces and stuff, and do stuff like that. It's basically the same thing. But yeah, let's say we inset all these faces, like inset this one, inset this one, inset this one, and then inset this one, and then we select all these faces, and we extrude them out, and select these or something. We can extrude individual faces, and that basically kind of takes away any kind of problems. The cube really isn't the best example for it, but in some cases you'll have problems with extrusions where the faces will stick together when you don't want them to, and that's just basically where you'll use extrude individual faces. So I'm going to select this whole thing and then dissolve faces. That's not what I wanted to do. I'm just gonna import a new cube. And yeah, we also have inset faces, poke faces, which just adds a vertice in the middle of them. You can see there's a vertice in the middle of all these now. That's basically just poking, like imagine like taking a small little needle and poking a hole in a like paper cube or something. That's what that does. So I'm gonna undo that. Bridge faces, basically if you have like a face that's, or yeah, a face that is coming out but you want to connect it with another face, you can select those two faces and then click bridge faces, and that will bridge those two faces together and make them one. UV unwrap faces, this is if you want to UV unwrap just a specific face. I'll get into unwrapping here in a little bit. And then we have triangulate faces, which basically turns the faces from quads to triangles. We have tris to quads. If you have any tris in your object, you can turn them to quads. Shading smooth just basically takes anything that looks like a polygon and makes it smooth. Shade flat just makes all the faces visible as like flat shading. Unsubdivide, let's say we like subdivide this and we click unsubdivide, it unsubdivides our plane. It's pretty self-explanatory. Split, I don't really know what this does off the top of my head because the cube doesn't really do anything with that. Separate, if you have, let's say you have like multiple objects in edit mode and then now they're one object in edit mode, you can click separate and then by selection, and now if we tab back out we can see that this cube is now separate from these two objects. Also, I should probably mention that if you duplicate or do anything to an object in edit mode, it stays in edit mode and it combines it into one object. That's a mistake I made a long time ago. Then we have dissolve faces, which I've already explained, and delete faces. So if we want to delete this face, we could by clicking delete face. So that's pretty much edit mode explained. Now we're going to go on to materials. So for materials, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift A and add a UV sphere. And I'm going to shift A and then add a plane and just bring the plane down and then scale it up. And now we have the sphere right here. So I'm going to go ahead and teach you this shortcut for subdividing, for adding a subsurface modifier to a object. It's control and then a number on your top row of numbers on your keyboard. So if I hit control 2, it adds a level 2 subdivision. You can also change this up, and then we can click shade smooth to make the ball smooth. So if we're in cycles, we're going to go into cycles for this, and we look at it, it's the exact same thing we saw earlier at the beginning of the video with this ball, but this time we're going to change the material. So the materials, basically you can click new to add a new material, and then you have your surface, which you have all these BSDFs and stuff. I actually have an entire video explaining all material nodes and some procedural nodes and texture nodes. So I'm not going to explain that in this video. I know this video says learn everything in one video, but that is a lot to go back over. So if you really want to know what every single one of them does without testing it out yourself, then go watch that video. But the default is principal BSDF, and the principal BSDF is the default surface since Blender 2.79 when it used to be diffuse. But the principal BSDF I like to call the all-in-one shader because it pretty much has everything. Your base color obviously changes the color of your object. So you can see if we turn it to this like light green, it turns to light green, and just different stuff like that. So we have this. We have your subsurface, which lets you see light through the object. You also have the subsurface radius, which is how big or small it is on each axis. You have the color of your subsurface. You have how metallic the object is. This is pretty much 1 or 0. It's never really in between. It looks weird. But yeah, you can see this isn't like this metallic gold kind of stuff now. And then 0 just puts it back to this like plasticky stuff. Specular is how much it absorbs light. So if we turn it all the way down to 0, it doesn't absorb any light whatsoever. This is pretty apparent with black. You can see black with 0 specular absorbs all light. And black with a specular of 1 doesn't absorb all light and reflects it off. So, that's that. I'm going to turn this down back down to 0.5. Specular tint is the color it reflects back from the light. Roughness is the roughness value of the material, so all the way up makes it to where it doesn't reflect as much light and absorbs more, and the roughness all the way down makes it kind of shiny. You can't really see it, but you can see right there it's really shiny. If we turn it like a little bit higher, you can see it's a lot shinier now. Anisotropic is pretty much metal. It gives that like a ring effect that like pots and pans have, which you can change from anywhere from 0 to 1. Anisotropic rotation, it controls the rotation on the object of the anisotropic. Sheen, I'm gonna turn these down. Sheen is basically like, if you've ever seen like blonde hair or something, like dirty blonde hair that reflects like a halo kind of looking thing of light, that's what sheen is. Clear coat basically adds a second layer on top of your mesh. So if I turn this down to 0, you can see that we have a new layer, kind of like this glossy layer. And then we can change the clear coat roughness. If we change that to 0 and then we change this to 0, you can see the difference right there. This is more shiny now. It's basically if you like made like a clay sculpture and put like a can of clear coat over it. It now has that like glossy finish. Index of refraction. This is pretty much only used for transparent objects with refraction like plastics, water, glass, and so on. Each object has its own IOR value, and you can look it up. There's a whole list of them for doing that. Transmission is glass. All the way up is fully glass. And then we can change the transmission roughness if you want like a full glass material. This isn't completely see-through because we have the roughness turned all the way up here. So you can see now it is completely see-through. And if we turn it all the way up, it is like this frosted glass type of thing. And then we have the transmission roughness. And then we have the emission value. This is different than regular emission because we can see that the mesh inside still carries over. If we just have a regular emission shader, it's just a ball of light. So alpha. Alpha is how transparent the object is. If you have it all the way down, the object is completely transparent. If we have it up some, the object is partially transparent. Up more, it's more translucent than transparent, and then all the way up, it is solid. Then we have volume. If you want to give it a volume node, the volume materials are volume absorption, volume scatter, and then principal volume. If you're using a volume, you can't put it in the surface value. You have to put it in the volume value. And displacement, you can change what type of displacement you want and stuff like that. You have your settings for a bunch of different stuff like displacement, volumes, and your index, your render passes and stuff. You have your settings, which I literally just explained. You have your viewport display, which shows how it looks in like your viewport, which you can see metallic all the way up, makes it metallic. Roughness, we can change the roughness of the object, which is pretty cool. We can also change the color of it in our viewport. You can also change backface culling, which basically means that the back of the object, when it's not shown, you can't really see it now because when we look at it, it's obviously shown. But just imagine the sphere is cut in half right now and we can't see the backside because the backside is not rendering. Then we have screen space refraction, subsurface translucency. Cycles pretty much automatically does this. This will only work in Eevee really. You can change refraction depth and stuff. The custom properties I already went over is Python scripts and such. And now we can go into these tabs at the top. So we have modeling, which is pretty much just edit mode, which I showed earlier. I pretty much went over all you really need to know about this. Sculpting is pretty cool. If you are not into poly modeling, you can use sculpting. You can basically just sculpt the mesh with a bunch of different brushes. There's a ton of different ones. Sculpting, you have like the sculpt draw tool. F is to size your brush. Shift F is to change the strength. So you can see now it's a lot It's a lot stronger. Up here you have your X, Y, and Z axis. So I have X axis on right now, which is why it is using both axes. But if I turn that off, you can see it's only affecting one now. The Y axis, it affects the bottom part now. I think the bottom part at least. It's affecting one of them. No, it's affecting the other one. You can see where it is by this little line that, or the other little dot that's on the screen. And then Z, I'm pretty sure, just affects the Z axis and so on, so on. Dynamic topology. This basically adds more topology when needed to the mesh. So you can see right now it's adding more topology, and as we get closer and closer to it, it adds smaller and smaller details. You can turn on relative detail, which is how the detail size is calculated. Relative detail means as we get closer and stuff, it turns from what we need to that, and then we get farther away, and it kind of goes into this low poly mess. But if we turn it on to like constant detail, and then we change the resolution up, we can see that it's constant and doesn't really matter how far away we are from it. Brush detail is just basically what the brush detail needs, and then manual detail is you have to enter values in and stuff like resolution and stuff. And then remesh, this is basically the same thing that I explained earlier. You can remesh your object. So if we remesh it, and then if we select it, we could remesh it. But Blender does not like this sculpt right now. So Blender crashed. It's all good though. We're going back to the sculpting tab. But yeah, remesh basically remeshes the object. And then options, you can change the options that whatever you want for the sculpting mode. Brush, you can choose like all your brush settings and stuff. Texture, if you want to sculpt a texture on it. Stroke, you can change the stroke of your brush, the fall off of your brush, custom, smooth, smoother, sphere, root, sharp, linear, sharper, inverse, square, and constant. And then you can choose to display your cursor or not, which is basically just if you want to display your little sculpting thing right here. And yeah, next is UV editing. This is what will happen if you UV unwrap your mesh. So right now you can see in the UV editor, we already have our plane mapped. We have these 4 vertices for the 4 plane. But if we select our sphere and go to UV editing, we can see that we have the sphere unwrapped too. Pretty much all primitives in Blender are already unwrapped. That's pretty much the point of them. But if you have a custom model, you'll have to UV unwrap them yourselves, which is done pretty much by hitting U and then unwrap or smart UV project. If you want a really precise and good UV map, you'll have to use like mark seams and like make seams and stuff. That's basically where the texture kind of connects together. Like imagine you have like a stuffed animal or something, and you have like the seams in the side where they're sewed together and stuff. That's basically that. Texture paint, if you're trying to paint a texture on an object, you can also just draw textures. So for example, if I want to draw something on this thing right here, you could use like you create a new texture, click OK, and now you have this, and then you can like draw stuff, do this, and now what we can do is we can hit rendered and then use a material, base color, or we should be able to texture paint this material. And then take this basically, base color, image texture, and then we just put our texture that we just made on there. So you can see the texture where I drew right there is on there now. I couldn't find that option for a second and I was confused, but yeah, that's what texture painting is. And then once you have the texture applied, you can basically just literally paint on your object. If you have a texture, a pre-made texture, you can also paint that pre-made texture on the object, which is pretty cool. You also have all your brush settings right here, which you can change your color palettes, just different stuff like that, what texture you're trying to use and stuff like that. Shading, this is basically a more complicated materials tab, but it's basically the same thing except you can connect nodes together. So again, this was pretty much all explained in my material nodes tutorial that I did. So if you want to see that, then go watch that. But yeah, Shift A is to add in this menu, and then you can add just different nodes, connect them together and stuff. But yeah, that's that. And then this material output is what's actually shown on the material. So for example, if I use like a glass BDSDF and then put this into the surface, we can see that now our surface is glass, and it looks really garbage because it's not shaded smooth, which now it is, and this is just a preview. So now we have animation, your animation tab. I'm gonna go ahead and explain animation right here. Basically, this is where you'll be doing all your animating, your dope sheet and stuff. To add a keyframe, all you have to do is hit I and then location, rotation, and scale, and we see it adds a set of keyframes right here. And then we can move it, hit I, move it to like frame 10, and then move it, click I, location, rotation, scale, move it to like frame 50 or something, I, location, rotation, and scale. We click this, click play, and we can see now our sphere is animated. So that's animation pretty fast. But yeah, just click I to keyframe something. If you want to keyframe a specific value of the object, just come over here to it, right click, and then click insert keyframe, or you can clear keyframes and stuff like that. And now we have rendering. This is basically where your render result is going to be. To render, you can either go to render and then render image F12 and then render animation F12, or like I just said, you can use the keyboard shortcuts, which image is F12 and then animation is control F12. And to view your render, you can hit F11, and to view your animation, you can hit control F11. And you can also render out audio itself if you want to. And then next, compositing. Compositing is basically used when you are finished with your render and you want to add post-processing effects. So for example, like glare, blurs, shadows, and stuff like that. Next, scripting. This is if you know anything about Python, this is what you'd use. This basically, you can script and then automate a bunch of stuff in Blender. You can make add-ons and just different stuff like that. It's really cool. I know nothing about it though. I know one other Blender YouTuber that I know, Curtis Holt, made a Bygen add-on, made quite a few add-ons actually, and he started before he actually made add-ons, just like scripting them out, and then he released them as full add-ons, which is pretty cool. The add-ons like Bygen and then like spaceship generator and then like abstract city generator. That's not the actual name of the last one. I can't remember what it's called, but yeah. But yeah, that's pretty much that. And now what we can do is explain modifiers. So I'm going to go ahead and go out of render view, and we can look at our sphere, and we can go to our modifiers tab. So we can already see we have one modifier, which is our subdivision surface that we added a little while ago. And yeah, this modified our mesh by adding more faces and more geometry. To apply a modifier, which basically sets it in, locks it in, means it can't be changed after it, you click this little arrow and then click apply, and that modifier is now applied. So if we go into edit mode now, we can fully see that our sphere has more geometry than when it started. You have a ton of modifiers. I am not even going to try to explain all these because, to be honest with you, I don't know what half of them do, and you can learn Blender for years and years and still not know what all of them do. But basically, all the modifiers you're pretty much going to use are under the generate and deform category. If you're doing physics, it'll obviously be under the physics category. But for example, array, I'll explain a few. Array basically just creates another one of the object in a fixed count, makes an array of them, basically. And then the bevel, you can't really see it in this one. But for example, if I add a cube or something, not a plane, a cube, and then bring it over and then use the bevel modifier, it bevels it out. You can also hit Control B in edit mode and do the same thing. It's just modifiers are another way of doing it. Next we have build. which basically is a build modifier. So if I go to frame 1 and then start playing, you can see it builds out the mesh in this kind of cool thing. You can make a lot of effects with this. It's really cool. Next we have decimate, which collapses and makes you have less geometry. So for example, if I do this and then click apply, we can see that we have a lot less geometry. And this is a pretty cool time for me to show you the remesh thing too. If we go into our vertex groups and remesh, and then we click voxel remesh or something, you can see that most of our faces are now quads, which is pretty cool. But I'm going to go ahead and undo all that and clear this out. Then you have the remesh modifier, which pretty much just does the same thing that I just explained. Screw modifier, which doesn't work well at all with the sphere. Basically makes the object a screw. We have solidify, which gives the object more depth inside. It solidifies the inside of the object. Then we have triangulate, which triangulates the faces of the mesh. So if I go to edit mode, apply, we see that the meshes are now triangles. So if I exit that out, yeah, we have different stuff like that. We also have displace, which is how you'll do displacements. Basically, to do displacements, you just add a displace modifier, click new on the texture, go to this little tab right here that's at the rightmost. It'll take you to this page. You can either use a displacement map that you have, or you could use one of these procedural textures. You can see if I use clouds, it makes this like, it uses this cloud texture to displace the geometry on this. You can change the size and stuff. You can also change the strength to like 0.5 or something to get this kind of meatball looking thing. But yeah, that's the displace modifier, and that's just a few modifiers that I'd like to explain. So now we're going to talk about lights and lighting and stuff. So a few ways to go about lighting. So the default lamp that's in Blender by default is a point light. So a point light just brings light. I'm gonna change this to a principled again, but we can see not a principal volume, a principal BSDF. But we can see the point light just basically gives light from a single point. The closer it gets, the brighter it's gonna be. It just gives light from a point. You can multiply this by like Shift D. Shift D is how you duplicate objects. I should probably explain that before, but yeah, if you hit Shift D, you can duplicate an object. And these lights, you can duplicate and put them all around. Set up lighting setups like that. And the next light is a sunlight that we're gonna use. A sunlight is just it simulates the sun. So you can change the direction of this and change the strength over here to like 10 or something. You can change the color of the lights and stuff like that. Next is going to be spotlight. Spotlight's pretty self-explanatory. It's literally just a spotlight. You can change the power up like really high to like 1,000 to see the spotlight. You can also change the radius of the spotlight, the size of the cone, how like small or big you want it, and then how much it blends with the scene, and how like pretty much how sharp it is. That's that. And next is area light. This shines light from a specific area. So you can see if I do this and then increase the strength to like 500, it shines light from this area. And then I'm gonna change this to like 1,000. And we can also duplicate these lights. This is one of the best lighting setups, to be honest, is a 3-point light setup, which is basically 2 lights in the front, 1 light in the back, or 2 lights on the side and then 1 light in the middle. Just something that that shows light on all sides. And I'm gonna go ahead and go into cycles, and yeah, we can see that the light looks like this. Go to GPU compute. But yeah, we can see the lighting looks like this. To disable any kind of overlays or effects in the viewport, you can go up here to the top right where it says show overlays, these little 2 balls right here, and then click it and it disables all the overlays. And I'm gonna go back into Eevee right now. And yeah, that's basically lights. You can change the power, you can change the specular of them, you can change the shape, or whether you want them to be a rectangle, disc, ellipse, or square. Changing the size changes the size of the lights. It gives it softer shadows. So if I do this and this, and then this, it kind of takes away the harshness of those shadows and makes them bigger and softer. So that is that. Also, what you can do is you can change the background color to give light to. So dark gives no light, and then white gives full light. You can also change this to like a sky color or something. You can click this little color ball right here, this yellow ball, and then you can use a bunch of textures. For example, brick texture gives this really, really creepy effect. I don't like this. I have not used this texture in so long, and this is just such a creepy effect. You can use a checker texture, which is less creepy, but still makes me feel like I just woke up inside of a dreamscape. Environment texture, which is where you'd use an HDRI. HDRIs are basically images that give lighting data. They're just basic 360-degree scenes from real life. You can use a gradient texture, which is basically just a gradient. And you can use like a magic texture, which this is trippy. You can use a noise texture, which is just a basic noise texture. You can use point density, which I'm not really sure what that is, pretty much. Sky texture. This is like a sky texture. You can change it, what kind it is. But yeah, this is just like a basic sky texture. Voronoi texture, so on, so on. You get the point, basically. But yeah, and if you disconnect that, it just changes it back to the base color. And yeah, that's basically that. I think I've covered pretty much everything you might need to get started in Blender. That's pretty much it. I explained how to move around, the basic UI, how to add meshes, keyboard shortcuts, lighting, the tabs at the top, sculpting, modeling, edit mode, collections, groups. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for you to get started in Blender. So, thanks guys so much for watching. Make sure if you did watch this video to the end, I have so many other tutorials, and if I didn't cover something in this video, there is most definitely a tutorial on my channel where I did. So, make sure to go check those out. Thanks guys so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. That really helps my videos get out to more people and lets me help more people. But thanks guys so much for watching. My name is Michael from Polygon Island. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.